I see a lot of weightlifters in my clinic who come in with chronic injuries, poor posture, and low back pain. And then I see a lot of runners too, with poor movement patterns and just ongoing joint issues. And both groups are missing the same thing that could potentially prevent these issues and add healthy years to their life. It's the third pillar of an exercise routine targeted at longevity, and that is core, mobility, and balance training. And for me, that's Pilates. So every day for 30 days, I did either mat or reformer Pilates to see how it would affect my markers of mobility, balance, core endurance, and even body composition. And truthfully, I was shocked by the results. But first, let's look at the science as to why mobility and balance training are such an underrated tool for longevity.
So it's worth noting up front that aerobic training and resistance training are by far the two more foundational pillars when it comes to exercise routines for longevity. They have much more studied data when it comes to longevity outcomes than does mobility and balance training. For instance, resistance training in and of itself is associated with a 15% lower risk of all causes of death. And then being in the top 5% of cardiorespiratory fitness compared to the lower 5% is associated with a 5-year increase in lifespan. And then there are countless other studies demonstrating lower risks of all causes of death with improvements in strength or aerobic fitness markers. And we've talked about longevity-focused regimens for both of these pillars in prior videos. For instance, in our top 5 resistance training exercises for longevity and in our rucking video, which I think is the best cardio for longevity. But to me, we are leaving a lot of longevity gains on the table if we are just performing resistance and aerobic training. And this is exactly where mobility, balance, and core endurance training come in as the third pillar of an exercise routine that's targeted at longevity. And while there is less longevity data on this type of training, we do still have some studies noting improved markers of longevity with improved markers of mobility or balance. For instance, one study noted that for every 1 second improvement in balance ability, we got a 10% lower risk of all causes of death. And then multiple other studies, including meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials, note that an inability to complete balance tests is associated with a higher risk of all causes of death. And this holds true even when balance is separated out from strength or from walking speed. Essentially, with studies then noting that balance ability in and of itself is associated with lower risk of all causes of death. And then we also have studies on the longevity impact of mobility, which we'll define for our purposes here as the ability to properly move a joint through its full range of motion in a controlled manner. And studies have noted that with increased joint stiffness and with decreased range of motion of joints, there is an associated loss of functional mobility with age, or essentially a loss of the ability to complete daily activities. And maintaining this functional mobility is super related to longevity outcomes in the studies. For instance, we have one study noting that for every 1 unit increase in functional mobility, there was an associated 2% decreased risk for all causes of death. And then not only are balance and mobility associated with better longevity, but so is core endurance. For instance, one 8,000 person Canadian cohort study demonstrated that improved abdominal muscular endurance, measured by sit-ups, was independently associated with a lower risk of all causes of death, even when controlling for cardiorespiratory fitness levels. And finally, even though flexibility has not been consistently associated with a lower risk of all causes of death, it has been pretty consistently associated with decreased arterial stiffness, which is definitely associated with decreased cardiovascular events. And this fact has been demonstrated in multiple studies, including meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials. And again, this was found to be the case independent from the effects of cardiorespiratory fitness or strength. So overall, improved balance, mobility, core endurance, and flexibility are all either associated with decreased risk for all causes of death or associated with lowering risk for certain markers of disease. And most often, these associations were proven to not be due to the confounding effect of just improved cardiorespiratory fitness or strength, signaling that mobility and balance training in and of itself may provide additional longevity benefit on top of strength and aerobic training alone. But outside just improving longevity through this disease and death prevention, we also have a decent amount of data on mobility and balance training improving health span, or essentially adding quality years to the end of your life. For instance, as we already mentioned, measures of mobility, such as range of motion of certain joints, has definitely been associated with improved ability to complete daily activities as you age. And similarly, balance training has also been associated with improved physical functioning with age and in a dose-dependent manner. And specifically, both balance and mobility training have been associated with less fall risk. And falling is a significant cause of injury and just worsening health span in the older population. And importantly, studies have noted that strength training alone is not near as beneficial as multi-component exercise when it comes to decreasing this fall risk or just improving functionality. And multi-component exercise includes mobility and balance training. And furthermore, outside of just improving general functionality and improving fall risk, this mobility, balance, and core endurance training can also help decrease injury risk in general, which is obviously super important for health span. While poor flexibility and mobility alone have not been consistently associated with increased injury risk, poor movement patterns have been, with one study noting that low-quality movement patterns assessed through the functional movement screen, or FMS, were associated with a 7-fold increase in injury risk. And certain mobility and balance training methods have been associated with improved scores on the FMS, and specifically Pilates has been. Thus, Pilates specifically could be working to decrease injury risk, although this is yet to be directly proven. And then specifically for those that already have low back pain, improving trunk mobility and flexibility, and then even core endurance could definitely assist with decreasing this pain. And again, Pilates training specifically has been demonstrated pretty consistently to lower scores of back pain and back pain related disability. So overall, the case for adding mobility, balance, and core endurance training to your exercise routine targeted at longevity is this. One, again, we have data on this type of training being associated with a reduced risk for all causes of death after removing the confounding effect of cardiorespiratory fitness and strength. And two, we also have data on mobility and balance training being associated with improved functionality with age, decreased fall risk, and maybe even decreased injury risk in general. And all of this could potentially add quality, more independent years to the later part of your life, and could provide these things on top of what strength training and aerobic training alone could give you. So if training mobility, balance, and core endurance is as beneficial for longevity as we're saying it is, then the question becomes, how exactly do you add this type of training to your routine? And based on the title of the video, you probably guessed how I'm doing it, and that is through Pilates. But Pilates is definitely not the only way to train mobility, balance, and core endurance. There are definitely dedicated methods of training each of these things individually, and then you could just combine them to get the whole effect. And then there are certain forms of yoga or martial arts that, similar to Pilates, can work on all three things: the mobility, the balance, and the core endurance, all within one single practice. But to me, Pilates is the best, well-balanced single practice to cover all of these aspects of fitness. And it also has the best studies behind it for doing so. For instance, there are multiple studies demonstrating that Pilates has the ability to improve all of these markers that we talked about previously that are associated with longevity. One meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials noted that in older individuals, Pilates was able to improve markers of dynamic balance as well as hip and back flexibility and mobility. And then in a different study in female college students, Pilates was found to improve flexibility scores measured through a sit and reach, and also was found to improve markers of static and dynamic balance, as well as markers of abdominal muscular endurance measured by curl-ups. And similarly, in yet a different study in middle-aged women, Pilates was found to improve markers of flexibility, balance, and core strength. And again, all of these are the same markers that we talked about being associated with longevity outcomes. So while there are no studies directly looking at Pilates' association with all causes of death, for instance, the improvement of these predictors of longevity does give some mechanistic rationale for Pilates being beneficial for longevity. However, that being said, what we don't have yet are many studies looking at what happens when you add Pilates or any of this type of training on top of an exercise routine that already contains resistance training and aerobic training. Because like we said at the onset, these two pillars, being cardio and resistance training, are the foundational pillars for exercise targeted at longevity. So the question is, would we already get all the mobility, balance, and core endurance benefits that we need from just resistance and aerobic training alone? Well, my hypothesis is that no, you would not. Because after all, as we already talked about, in many of the studies that show that mobility and balance are associated with lower risks of all causes of death, those same studies control for cardiorespiratory fitness and strength. And they still find that mobility and balance are independently, in and of themselves, associated with the lower risk of all causes of death, which signals to me that this benefit might be coming from something outside of just the cardio or strength improvements. And mechanistically, it would make sense that something like Pilates would have additional benefit on mobility, balance, and core endurance outside of the benefit you would get from resistance training or cardio, because Pilates directly targets these things much differently than does resistance or cardio training. And furthermore, I am not alone in this hypothesis, at least for older adults, as the general consensus in the literature notes that when it comes to performing exercise for longevity, multifaceted exercise regimens that include mobility and balance training are more beneficial than just resistance or aerobic training alone. So while I think there is a lot of basis for this hypothesis of Pilates adding additional longevity benefit on top of resistance and aerobic training alone, it really remains to be directly studied if this is for sure the case, especially in young, reasonably fit individuals. And this is why I was extremely excited to put this hypothesis to the test in myself. Basically, my main questions were this. One, as someone who already regularly does resistance training and aerobic training, would Pilates further improve my markers of mobility, balance, flexibility, and core endurance, and thus potentially further improve my longevity? And two, would adding Pilates, which more works on muscular endurance, hurt my ability to maintain muscle mass or maintain strength, both of which are even more important for longevity? And for the second question, we relied on one, my gym strength markers, but two, also my body composition measurements, which we got from the Hume Body Pod. I really love this scale as it allows you to track multiple markers of body composition over time, including your fat-free mass, your lean mass, your body fat percentage, etc. It essentially provides similar measurements to a DEXA or an in-body scan, but as a much more affordable, accessible option. And then for the first question, we measured multiple markers of my mobility, balance, flexibility, and core endurance to see if they would improve after 30 days of consistent Pilates. And when selecting markers for these things, we tried to select the most clinically validated tests that we could simply perform at home. And obviously, I'm not a physical therapist, so these measurements are definitely estimates, but helpful nonetheless. So specifically for mobility and flexibility measurements, we measured hip, shoulder, and ankle range of motion with a goniometer, and then also looked at shoulder mobility further with the functional movement screen shoulder test, and then looked at hip mobility further with the active straight leg raise, essentially seeing how far I could flex my hip joint one leg at a time and in a controlled manner. And then finally, trunk flexibility was measured through a modified sit and reach test. Then for balance, I wanted to measure both dynamic balance, or the ability to maintain stability with movement, as well as measure static balance, or the ability to maintain stability while not moving. So for dynamic balance, we used the Y balance test, essentially seeing how far you can reach one foot in 3 directions while maintaining balance on the plant foot. And then for static balance, we used the Stork balance test, or essentially standing on one foot until you lose balance. And I did this one with eyes closed to increase the difficulty. Then finally, for core endurance, I used the McGill core endurance test. Essentially 3 different movements that test different aspects of core endurance. One being trunk flexion, essentially maintaining about a 60-degree angle for as long as you can. 2 being trunk extension, or essentially maintaining a stable core and flat angle while having your legs supported and leaning off a bench. And then side planks, and holding this on each side for as long as possible. And then for all of these tests, these were my initial measurements, which we plan to then repeat after 30 days of consistent Pilates. So with my initial data collected, I jumped into my consistent 30 days of Pilates. And for this experiment, because I wanted to get as much learnings as possible and really see how much I could improve my markers in only 30 days, I did Pilates every single day for these 30 days. But in practice, long term, if you're fitting Pilates into a routine that already contains resistance and aerobic training, then you can likely get away with only 2 to 3 times per week, as this is generally what is studied and found to have all the positive outcomes that we talked about earlier. While 3 times per week is occasionally studied, 2 times per week is definitely the most studied frequency. And studies do demonstrate that for certain outcomes, like improving low back pain, 2 times per week is definitely better than 1 time per week. But 3 times per week could even be more efficacious than 2 times per week for certain outcomes. So doing at least 2, but maybe even 3 times per week is probably your best bet long term if you're looking to focus on longevity while still doing resistance and aerobic training, of course. Then for the duration of these sessions, the most studied is 60 minutes per session, again for generally those 2 sessions per week. However, one study did demonstrate that 60 minutes was equivalent to 30 minutes when both were just performed 2 times per week. So because of this, during my 30-day experiment, My sessions were on average 30 minutes per day, and sometimes longer if I was doing reformer, for instance. But again, for my long-term plan of incorporating Pilates into an exercise routine targeted at longevity, I would stick with about 2 to 3 times per week for about 30 minutes per session. I really believe this is enough to get us all the benefits that we've been talking about based on the studies, but it's not too much that it becomes practically difficult to implement when you're already doing resistance and aerobic training. But how should you actually perform these sessions for optimal longevity? Well, we don't have time here to discuss how to optimally perform Pilates, and I definitely don't claim to be an expert instructor or an expert doer of Pilates. But from a scientific perspective, I do think we should cover one big question in order to get you started on how to perform these sessions. And that question is, mat or reformer Pilates? Which is better for longevity? Well, we definitely have more studies on mat Pilates, with many randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses of these trials noting that mat Pilates demonstrates benefit for all of these aspects of fitness that we've been talking about. So mat Pilates is definitely your more tried and true method. But that being said, there are definitely a lot more studies coming out on reformer Pilates, and there are even some comparing reformer to mat. And interestingly, in the studies comparing these two, reformer is actually generally found to be slightly more effective than mat for certain outcomes in certain groups. For instance, when both were tested in soccer players, both mat and reformer improved almost every fitness outcome that was measured. However, reformer outperformed mat when it came to measures of agility, passing, and single leg hopping. Then when both reformer and mat were tested in individuals with low back pain, reformer was again more beneficial than mat at reducing this pain and related disability. And then finally, when tested in patients with multiple sclerosis, both reformer and mat were equivalent in improving their mobility, balance, and quality of life. But reformer was slightly better than mat at improving markers of trunk flexor strength. So while this data is definitely not conclusive to say that reformer is better than mat for every outcome, it is enough for me to say that including reformer in your routine would be a good idea for longevity if you had access to it. But the key term there is if you have access to it, because reformer can be pretty expensive depending on the studio, and buying a good machine yourself can also be pretty pricey. Compare this to mat Pilates, which has much more easily accessible options, including doing free YouTube sessions at home without any equipment needed other than just your mat. And this accessibility is really what drew me to Pilates as a sustainable source of mobility, balance, and core endurance training. So for this reason, and due to the fact that we have more studies on mat Pilates being beneficial for markers of longevity, my main source of Pilates during my 30-day experiment was 30-minute YouTube sessions from Move with Nicole. After trying different instructors out, I really liked her way of instructing, her varied movement patterns and routines, and just overall difficulty level. That being said, because I did want to get as much learnings as possible, and because the studies do seem to say that reformer might slightly edge out mat Pilates for certain outcomes, I did also do 2 sessions per week of reformer for about 45 minutes per session. And from my experience from doing the classes, and also just from my experience as a strength coach and from reading the studies, I do think that adding in the occasional reformer class could be beneficial for longevity for a few reasons. One is the ability to really supercharge your mobility and balance training especially. And this is because using the reformer allows you to get into positions in a controlled and active manner that you might not be able to get into just on the mat. For instance, putting your feet into the straps or doing certain lunge positions on the reformer were able to extend my hip range of motion much further than what I could go just on the mat. And it also forced me to hold these positions under some active tension provided from the springs. And then similarly, the reformer is also able to provide extra balance challenges that you could not get just with the mat alone. Then 2 is the ability to provide even more variability and complexity with the movements. And this variability to me does give it a slight edge compared to mat when it comes to translating these benefits to the real world, because your real normal life is obviously pretty varied. Then finally, 3rd is the ability of the reformer to slightly outperform mat when it comes to neuromuscular control and proprioception. The moving carriage and the more constant tactile feedback really help in further developing that mind-muscle connection, which is super important for longevity when we're talking about decreasing fall risk or just improving functionality with age. And to me, I think that this improved neuromuscular control and coordination with the soccer players is part of the reason that in the studies, the soccer players had improved technical skills in some outcomes when the reformer was used. So all to say, if you do have access to a reformer, I think doing this at least 1 time a week and then doing mat the other would be more beneficial for longevity than just doing mat alone. So again, for me, for my experiment, I did 5 days of mat Pilates and 2 days of reformer Pilates per week. And from there, at least when you're starting out, it's all about finding a high quality instructor who can walk you through your sessions to appropriately hit mobility, balance, and core endurance training. And if they're using classical Pilates moves, then they likely will. But with this experiment setup, was I able to see any improvements in my balance, mobility, and core endurance? Or did my muscle mass or strength suffer? Well, from a body composition standpoint, again, we measured before and throughout the experiment with the Hume Body Pod. And again, I really think the scale does a great job of tracking trends over time for multiple markers of body composition. And on this scale, we found that my lean mass and my fat-free mass and even my body fat percentage all did not really change over time. And all this was honestly super encouraging to see, as losing muscle mass is a big concern for many when adding Pilates into a routine when you're already doing resistance training. And then similarly, when it came to maintaining strength, I also noted a slight improvement in my lifts, if anything. Part of this could be due to Pilates improving my mobility, which we'll talk about later, but it also could be due to the fact that it really helped with some low back tightness I've been having, as well as helped with some chronic joint discomfort that I've had. And all of this just made my lifts feel a little bit more smooth, controlled, and just more fluid. So at least for me, over the 30 days, Pilates definitely did not negatively impact my muscle mass or my strength. However, I'm definitely no bodybuilder or competitive strength athlete by any means. And if you were really trying to max out muscle mass or strength, then it really remains to be seen if Pilates would be detrimental to you there. But really, it's my hunch that doing it only 2 to 3 times a week for 30 minutes per session would not even detriment those populations of people. And I definitely think that in those more focused on longevity as a whole, or even athletes more focused on performance, Pilates is not going to hurt your muscle mass or strength. And in fact, it could even benefit, as was seen in the studies on adolescent baseball or soccer players. But what were the benefits when it came to mobility, balance, and core? Well, truthfully, I was honestly amazed at just how much these things improved in only 30 days of Pilates. For mobility measures, my sit and reach score went from 7 centimeters all the way up to 18 centimeters. And my FMS shoulder mobility screen went from about 14 centimeters between my hands to only 9 centimeters after. And then for my active straight leg raise, I increased my range of motion by about 10 degrees on the right and 18 degrees on the left, which actually helped me become less asymmetrical here, which is actually super important for decreasing injury risk. And finally, for mobility measurements, my range of motion for all joints tested, the shoulder, hip, and the ankle, improved by about 15 to 30%, depending on the joint. And then to get an overall percent change in mobility, I aggregated all this together by grouping each test into different functional domains, and then averaged the percent change in each of the functional domains. And by doing this, I got a 23.1% improvement in my mobility over these 30 days of Pilates, with the largest gains being in trunk flexibility, hip mobility, and shoulder internal rotation. Then next up is balance. And here again, we used the Y balance test to test for dynamic balance. And here for all measurements, I improved by about 10 to 30%, which truthfully, I could really feel that improvement when I was doing the test, and it just felt way more fluid. And then for static balance, again, we used the Stork balance test, and we really saw huge improvements here, going from an average of 7.5 seconds to 12.5 seconds on the left, and going from 6.5 seconds to 14.3 seconds on the right. And because of these large improvements, when we aggregated the dynamic and static balance percent changes, we got a total balance improvement of 54.3% over the 30 days. And then finally, for core endurance, again with that McGill core endurance test, my trunk extension test improved by 18.9%, my trunk flexion test improved by 25.1%, and then my side planks improved by 11.9% on the right and 24.8% on the left. So then when I aggregated all that together to see my overall core endurance improvement, I got a 20.1% improvement in core endurance over the 30 days. However, what didn't really improve was my flexion to extension ratio, my side plank to extension ratio, and my right to left side plank ratio. So because of this, I definitely still have some asymmetries I need to continue to work on, and I'm interested to see if Pilates will help this with further training. But overall, with maintained muscle mass and strength, as well as with a 23% improvement in mobility, a 54% improvement in balance, and a 20% improvement in core endurance, I was extremely happy and honestly just surprised by how much benefit I got out of my Pilates training when I was already completing resistance and aerobic training consistently. And again, while we don't have a ton of hard data on adding Pilates into a routine that already contains resistance and aerobic training, all the data we do have does point towards it being a worthwhile add for longevity. And at least for me, based on the data I got from this experiment, I'll definitely be continuing Pilates as part of my exercise routine focused on longevity. And if you're interested in using the scale that we used in this experiment yourself, aka the Hume Body Pod, check out the link in the description. It really is is impressive at tracking all these metrics that we're talking about, and a side benefit is that it can also give you tips on how to reach certain goals. You can get 50% off with the code in the description, and it's HSA FSA eligible. Now, if you want to check out my other 30-day experiments for longevity, check out this playlist here, and then subscribe for my next experiment on fasting coming soon.